In Android, a service is a component that performs long-running operations in the background without a user interface. It is used to execute operations that need to continue even if the user switches to a different application or interacts with the application in ways that don't involve direct UI. Now let's get into details and discuss each one of them. To pick a service for a background task on Android, you need to consider the nature of the task and its requirements. There are three primary types of services in Android for handling background tasks. The first service is a foreground service, performs a task that is visible to the user and keeps the service running indefinitely. It must display a persistent notification in the notification bar to make the user aware of its activity. Example use cases are playing music in the background, tracking location for navigation apps, long-running tasks like downloading files. For Android 8 Plus, it requires to launch a foreground service by starting the method called startForegroundService. Another service is a background service, performs a task that the user does not directly notice without any UI or notification. Example use cases: synchronizing data with remote server, periodic cleanup or offline processing in the application. The starting method called just start service. And since Android 8, background services are heavily restricted and you'll often need to use alternatives like foreground service or work manager. Another type is a bound service, allows other components, for example any activity or fragment, to bind to it and interact with it via an API. It is designed for long-term communication between the service and other application components. Bound services are terminated when no component is bound to them. Example use cases: streaming audio or video, where the service needs to provide real-time data to any UI. Another use case is the inter-process communication for apps with both server and client components. The bind method is just a bind service. Most Android services inherit from the service class, which provides essential methods to manage the service lifecycle. The first method called when the service is started with start service. This method is where the task logic is placed. It must specify how to handle the service if the system kills it. So the first flag, start not sticky, do not recreate the service after termination. Start sticky, restart the service with no intent after termination. And the last one, start redeliver intent, restart the service and redeliver the last intent after termination. Another method is called when a component binds to the service using bind service, returns the iBinder object that the client uses to interact with the service, needed for bound service. Another two methods, when the service is first created to perform one-time setup, for example initializing resources, and the last one called when the service is stopped or destroyed, typically used for cleanup, for example closing databases or stopping threads. To define a service in your Android app, it must be declared in the Android manifest.xml file, just like this. You can specify additional attributes to control how the service behaves and interacts with the operating system. If you need the service to only be accessible within your app, set exported to false. For resource isolation or preventing app crashes from affecting the service, run it in a different process. Optimize foreground service performance to specify tasks like location or media playback. For this, use foreground service type. Another attribute indicates whether the service will run in any isolated process separate from other components in the app. Any isolated process has a distinct UID and does not share memory with other app components. Last one indicates whether the process for the service should be created using App Zygote, a memory optimization feature in Android. How service works. To start a service that runs in the background, we need to create new intent object with the main context and past class. Invoke start service method of the main context with newly created intent. To bind the service to any activity or fragment, we create new intent like previously, but this time we need to bind it with bind service method. Here connection is any implementation of a service connection which manages the interaction between the requesting component and the service. Last one, to stop a service, we must invoke stop service method of the main context with intent. A running service can be implicitly or explicitly stopped. For implicit stop, for bound services, the service stops when all clients unbind. For explicit stop, use stop self or stop service for started services. To sum up, a service is a critical Android component for running tasks in the background, especially for long-running operations or those not requiring user interactions. Depending on your use case and system restrictions, you should determine whether to use a foreground service, background service, or bound service. For most modern apps, foreground services and work managers are often the most reliable and system-compliant choices. See you in the next one.